And I will say, I tend to have like 5 or 6 things I tell people like for longevity that are the big levers. So the first one is,
what is the best diet in your estimation to build muscle for maximum health and longevity?
the best diet to build muscle. Well, I think there's, looking at this from a high level, there's a few things that are kind of fundamental pillars of muscle building nutrition. So the first thing that's the obvious one that everyone will know, or probably know, is adequate protein. So we know whether it's building muscle or maintaining lean mass while in a caloric deficit, what really tends to make or is the biggest lever to pull is protein. So if we look at studies where they do low to moderate protein, like 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram, versus people who resistance train and they're getting like 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, you do get significantly better lean mass accrual with that higher end of protein. Now, I always try to keep it in context for people. This isn't going to be the difference between, going from like 150 pounds to 200 pounds versus 180 pounds. Like the differences are relatively small. Resistance training and a properly structured resistance training program is still the biggest lever by far to pull. And the only reason I touch on that is some people get so focused on the wrong things or the little nuances that they forget the big stuff, which is, hey, if you're not in the gym training hard consistently for a long period of time, you're not going to build that much muscle. Because I always tell people, if you think fat loss takes patience, muscle building takes infinitely more patience, because at least with fat loss, like week to week, you can start seeing differences. But with muscle building, I mean, you're talking about months. And then once you get to like an intermediate or advanced level, you talk about years. But with regards to nutrition, protein's the biggest lever we have. Then I would say caloric surplus. Some people will argue with me on this because there are some studies demonstrating that you can build muscle and lose fat while in a calorie deficit or even at maintenance. So some people have made the argument, well, why would you ever go into a surplus if you can just build muscle when you're at maintenance or a calorie deficit losing fat? And there was a recent meta-analysis and meta-regression that came out that showed, so let me just go back. A meta-regression is where they kind of project based on data we have what could be if we went further on either end of the spectrum. And so what they showed is that, yes, you can build muscle and lose fat, but you will never do either thing to the best of your ability if you're trying to do both at the same time.
Interesting.
And it does make sense from a mechanistic perspective. Like if we look at what, being in a calorie deficit, you activate AMP kinase, that's an inhibitor of mTOR, it inhibits downstream effects as well. So it would make sense that you would have some sort of interference effect. And just from I hate using these examples, but we just don't have that much data. So I will use a little bit of anecdote. I tell people, when I started lifting weights, I was 140 pounds at about the same body fat I'm at now. Now I'm over 200 pounds. Do you think I could have just like maintenanced my way there?
Yeah.
Because I really doubt it, right? Like you have to accrue tissue. And if you think about from a teleological perspective, if you are low in energy, your body is less likely to spare that protein for lean mass accrual because it's sensing an energy deficit. So it's more likely to oxidize that protein or convert it to energy substrate, because at the end of the day, if we're weighing two things, the first being, okay, survival and starvation versus building lean mass, I mean, there's just not the impetus to build a whole lot of lean mass if you're restricted. Now, again, there are times when that can happen. And I'll use 3 basic examples, not the only times it can happen, but these are the 3 common ones. And that's if you're overweight or obese, you can build muscle in a calorie deficit because you have so much of an energy surplus that's endogenous. It's not the same thing as a lean person going into a deficit. If you're a beginner to lifting weights, the mass effect of just resistance training is going to be so powerful that you can experience a recomposition effect, which is basically robbing Peter to pay Paul, because you're imposing this stressor on the muscle that it has to respond to So it has to get that energy from somewhere if you're at maintenance or a calorie deficit. So where's that energy going to come from? It's going to come from adipose to spare protein for lean tissue. And then the last one is performance enhancing drugs, which obviously change things. And then the fourth one would be any combination of those three. So now those are the two big things. So protein, calorie surplus. The one other thing I will say is there are some studies now looking at not necessarily low carb, but straight up like very low carb ketogenic diets. I think there's 3 studies now where they showed that in a calorie surplus where they match protein and match calories, you don't quite accrue the same amount of lean tissue on a ketogenic diet as you do on kind of with a sufficient amount of carbohydrate. It's just called a sufficient amount of carbohydrate. Now, that's not to say I'll say that and people will hear, Layne says you can't build muscle on a ketogenic diet. That's not true. You absolutely can. In these studies, they showed they did build muscle. It just wasn't as much as people who were having some carbohydrate. And my guess is that's probably due to the inhibitory effects of insulin on protein degradation. So a lot of people think about insulin as like an anabolic molecule, but in terms of skeletal muscle, I mean, we did this in our lab. We've given carbohydrate. It does not increase muscle protein synthesis. At least it doesn't initiate it. There's some evidence it may prolong the effect of protein, so may potentiate the duration of protein synthesis. But it does not, on its own, it does not initiate it. And that myth of insulin being anabolic kind of comes around from, we know that people who have type 1 diabetes tend to have less muscle mass because they don't produce insulin. We know if bodybuilders take like huge doses of insulin, it is in fact anabolic. And so people have kind of taken those 2 points and just drawn a straight line. And the reality is it's not like that. Yes, if you get insulin back to like a sufficient level, you'll get increased lean mass. But then in the physiological range, it kind of flatlines. And then like if it's possible that if you get like a really high dose, it gets out of that. And honestly, testosterone is actually kind of the same way. Now, people will say, well, if you're at the very low end of the normal range and very high end of the normal range, yeah, I get it. But for the most part, like 15, 20% differences in testosterone in the physiological range just don't make a difference in lean mass. It might make a difference in how you feel or sex drive, libido, those sorts of things, but not lean mass. So while insulin isn't anabolic in the physiological range, it does appear to be anti-catabolic. So there was a study done probably early 2000s where they gave carbohydrate alone, protein alone, or protein plus carbohydrate, and they used a methodology called AV balance. And so this is kind of getting into what I did my PhD with. I never used this technique in particular, but it's one of the ways that you can measure protein metabolism. So basically what they're doing is they're using a labeled amino acid tracer so they can see, and they're sampling the arterial blood and the venous blood coming out of the muscle bed and into a muscle bed. And so they're looking at, okay, how much of that label is going in and then how much is going out? And so the less of the label going out relative to what's going in, that says, okay, there's a net anabolic effect. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So what this study showed was when they added carbohydrate to that mix, they saw a decrease in muscle protein breakdown and an increase in the net deposition of amino acids into muscle tissue. So now you have the extreme people who will take this and say, well, this is why you need 100 grams of dextrose post-workout. And what I will say is the amount of carbohydrate you need to get that is probably relatively modest. It doesn't require a huge insulin spike or anything like that. But getting back to those kind of, I guess there's about 3 pillars I would look at, which is biggest one is protein. Next is calorie surplus, and then sufficient carbohydrate for building muscle. I'm
slightly confused with the calorie surplus thing. So we're saying to be in a calorie surplus for longevity?
So, okay. So for longevity,
or just overall health span, because we've heard, in the wellness community from especially some, longevity scientists who shall remain unnamed, that calorie deficits are the best way, at least in a lab, to extend the lifespan of an animal.
So absolutely great question. And this is where I think there's a lot of these conversations that aren't honing in on the nuance of this question. So I understand why it's a confusing topic for a lot of people, because it's like, well, Layne, you're talking about building muscle being the calorie surplus, but like people say being a calorie deficit. So what do I do? Well, first off, one of the things you have to realize is a lot of this research is in rodents. And I listen, all my research was in rodents. So I'm in no way dogging animal research, but there are some important distinctions between rodents and humans. And when it comes to this, one of the biggest ones is, one, the definition of calorie restriction in rodents, which I'll get to in a minute. And two, the way humans grow during their lifespan versus rodents. So rodents actually never stop growing almost their entire life. So humans, you actually tend to get to, you grow through your teenage years and then up into your 20s, and then you kind of cap out for the most part, right? Unless you're doing resistance training or whatever, or purposely overfeeding. And then you start to come back down eventually. So rodents tend to just keep growing. Now the growth rate slows down, but they don't really ever stop growing unless they just become really old for rodents. And the other thing is, when they look at a calorie restriction, so a lot of times if you look in the papers, they call it calorie restriction, not a calorie deficit. And there's an important distinction. And the reason they do that is because in many of these studies, the restriction is, okay, we're going to look at how much these animals are eating ad libitum, which basically means whatever they want, however much they want. And we're going to restrict that by 20 or 30%. I think 20% is, or 30% is one of the numbers they use. So we did that in the study because, one, we wanted to make sure that the animals were going to eat. We were asking a protein question in this study, but we restricted them by 20%. And these were like young adult Sprague Dawley rats. They never stopped growing, even by restricting their ad libitum intake by 20%. So it was still actually a surplus. It just wasn't as big of a surplus, right? The other thing I will say is there are some studies in monkeys, or I don't know if it's monkeys or just primates. We'll just say primates. Well, I think they used a calorie restriction level of 30%. Now, the other thing I want to point out is, while primates are close to us, and we do see extensions in lifespan with a calorie surplus, with a calorie deficit. Here's the interesting thing. It's not a calorie deficit forever, right? Because if it was, they would just die. Like they would actually starve to death, right? So what you're actually seeing in these studies, this is my opinion, what you're actually seeing is not necessarily the effects of a calorie deficit. You're seeing the effects of just not overfeeding, of just maintaining a healthy body weight. Because most animals, when left to their own devices with ad libitum feed, will overfeed. Think about the context of how humans live and how animals live. One of the biggest differences in how we live now is we're very sedentary. We don't have to go out and hunt our food and get it or whatever. Animals, if you just put them in a cage and they have access to food, they regulate their appetite a little bit better, but it's still not food like they're used to getting it, right? Like this is not how they see food in nature. Like if you're talking about rats that are like pelleted food, that is supposed to be kind of palatable, okay? Yeah. So I think we got to be careful when we interpret these results. And the other thing is, there's never really exercise as part of this equation. And again, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. And what I tell people, there is a very big difference between somebody who is in a controlled surplus while resistance training or doing exercise in order to accrue lean mass than there is somebody who's just sitting on the couch munching down potato chips. I think that is a really big contextual difference. And unfortunately, we just don't have the sophistication in research to pick that out. Now, this is, people could make a separate argument, as well, you're overfeeding, you're activating mTOR, all this kind of stuff. Here's one of the things I'll say. I love mechanisms. I'm a biochemist, but my undergrad was in biochemistry. I can nerd out with the best of them. But the longer I've been in this field and looked at the research in nutrition, I kind of go, mechanisms are cool to look at, but we have to understand that one mechanism, an isolated mechanism, is just one aspect of things. You got to think about metabolism is kind of like a symphony, right? You got all these separate things that are playing, but they all connect together, right? Well, if I make the tuba do something different, you may not really hear it that much in the absolute like overall context. What you're really looking at is when we look at outcomes, right? So we look at like human randomized control trials. And listen, one of the problems with human randomized control trials is you can't do a tightly controlled trial for years, right? Like it's very difficult to do.
Right.
But when we look at this stuff, it's like so many times we've had these mechanisms where we go, oh, this is going to be the thing. And then we do a human control trial where we think we're going to see differences and we just don't. And that's because that one mechanism is just part of what sums up to the overall outcome. And one of the things you have to understand is the human body is really resilient too. Like just think about this, for example. To get to the point where you actually have like metabolic syndrome and diabetes, for the most part, there are some people who are like normal weight and lean who develop type 2 diabetes, but that's pretty rare. You have to get to a point of pretty darn bad health before you actually start having effects from that, like downstream effects. Same thing, like you could survive on half of one kidney. So just think about how redundant our body's systems are and how robust they are. So when we're talking about the whole body outcomes, we just have to keep in mind that like, okay, yeah, I'm toward this, but what does that mean in the context of the overall equation, right? And I think that a lot of that is being lost on the longevity community. And again, if you look at longevity after age 65, so if we look at studies after age 65, it is very striking. Peter Attia talked about on our podcast. It is extremely striking how closely your lean mass is tied to your longevity after age 65. Now, of course, that's after age 65. That's a different context than the whole life. But I think one of the things I tell people with nutrition and training, we have to stop thinking about stuff as there's a solution. There may be better options depending on your specific goals or like disease or what you're trying to do. But there's no real solutions. There's only trade-offs, right? So, and Peter, again, I don't want to keep invoking his name, but he talked about like, you know, he was doing intermittent fasting, but he felt like he had lost some lean mass over the years. It's like, okay, maybe intermittent fasting is this lever you can pull that gives you some benefits, but okay, well, here's possibly the downside, right? And so I would just caution people as to, we just don't have the sophistication, the scientific studies yet to say conclusively, this prolongs longevity, this doesn't, in the context of like calories and whatnot. Now, I will say, I tend to have like 5 or 6 things I tell people like for longevity that are the big levers. So the first one is, forgive my French, but don't eat like an asshole, right? That's the first one. Exercise regularly, vigorously. Limit alcohol, drugs, all that kind of stuff, obviously. Don't smoke or really, limit it. Like, listen, as somebody who enjoys a cigar every once in a while, I get it. But, don't be chain smoking every day. That's a big deal.
You're a cigar guy. Am I? Yeah,
I mean, I'll have like 1 or 2 a month, something like that. But again, it's funny because people will reach out to me like, oh, how could you do that? Because you're this, and that. I'm like, hey, listen, like, yeah, okay, maybe it's the difference between me living to 80 and 80 and a half or 80 and 81. But I'm also looking at quality of life in terms of experience, right? Like those sorts of things. I'm not saying like people should go out and do that. It's not, I would never sit here and claim that, having a cigar is healthy for you. It's not, right? But I am aware of that trade-off.
Yeah.
I'm cognizant of that trade-off, right?
Informed consent.
So don't smoke, limit your stress, and try to sleep enough.
I like that.
Those are my big levers, and then I'm like, okay, if we get those in place, then let's worry about some of this other stuff.
Yeah. So basically get in the best shape possible for your genes, like get to your physical, reach your physical potential, your fitness potential.
I do think it can go too far. So again, these are kind of like association studies. So I'm really hesitant to put a lot of weight on them. But we do see, like, if you look at running and like some of these diseases, it's kind of a U-shaped curve, right? And exercise tends to be like that. Like if you get to like the point of over-exercising, there appears to be declining benefits. Now, is that because exercise has some negative effect on disease and longevity? I kind of doubt it. I think maybe there's some confounding variables there. People who over-exercise or who exercise a lot probably tend to be more stressed, OCD, obsessive, like all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like if we look at elite athletes, yeah, metabolically they're healthy, but is that the best thing for their health to push their body to that kind of extreme? It's hard to know because we're not going to get, scientific studies on elite athletes. So what I would say is like, you don't have to, have a six pack or, even like a lot of visible muscle to be metabolically healthy. And what's really cool is it doesn't actually take a huge dose of exercise or even a calorie deficit to get a huge benefit. If you look at research studies, and if you get people who are like the most adherent, so if we look at people who are the most adherent in research studies in a calorie deficit, they start to see resolution in their blood markers after like a few weeks. It's really one of these things where it's like, just stop overloading the system, right? Like that's a huge deal. Now, muscle could help with that because I hate these kind of analogies, but I use the analogy anyway. Muscle is like a metabolic sink. It's very greedy. So if you have more muscle tissue, you get away with a heck of a lot more. And you do see this with a lot of if we're talking about drug-free athletes, you see people who have higher levels of body fat, but they've also have higher levels of muscle. They tend to not have these same negative metabolic health outcomes. Now, they're not as metabolically healthy as people who are also lean with that much muscle, but they're way better off than people with the same amount of fat mass who don't have that much muscle, if that makes sense.
One thing that I want to gain further, that I've wanted to gain further clarity on, and you were talking about the resilience of the human body and how there are all these like built-in redundancies and back channels and whatnot. We know that with regard to fat loss, calories matter, right? But that insulin sort of has this effect when it's elevated of acting like a one-way valve on your fat cells, right? It prevents lipolysis and all this stuff. So how then can we continue to lose fat when insulin is elevated, right? Like you're a bodybuilder, you've gotten shredded, integrating copious carbohydrates into your diet. So without getting too into the weeds, like how does this work? So how is the body able to achieve both things, like have a high state of insulin, which disallows fat oxidation, right? But then also to still be able to burn that fat when in a calorie deficit?
So there's a couple pieces to this. The first one being, as you get, so it's kind of like how do I put it? There's multiple things in play. As you get leaner, you become more insulin sensitive. The same amount of carbohydrate doesn't take the same amount of insulin to clear. So that's one thing.
So like the dose of insulin is lower.
Right,
for a given bolus of carbohydrate.
Now, the other thing is that people don't talk about is if you're obese, your insulin response, you're more insulin resistant. Or if you have higher amounts of fat, you're more insulin resistant. But nobody thinks about that in the context of adipose. So you're still more insulin resistant in adipose as well. So the negative effects of insulin on lipolysis actually aren't as pronounced when you're overweight or obese. And it's very interesting. So to answer your question a little more directly, the first thing is people think about insulin as kind of like this lever that's an on and off switch, right? So if we turn on insulin, we secrete insulin, that means we're shutting down all fat burning and we're ramping up lipogenesis. So metabolism doesn't really work that way. It's more like, so if you think about a light switch where you walk in and the light's either on or off, metabolism would be like dimmer switches, okay? So you are always burning fat and storing fat at the same time. Those two processes occur simultaneously. Now, it's the relative rates of each that will determine how much body fat you gain or lose over a period of time. So the first thing is to think about in the context of meals, right? So let's just take 3 meals per day. And this is going to be a much longer answer than you were probably anticipating, but I think it's important to really hash out this nuance.
Yeah.
Let's take 3 meals a day. Okay, so you eat meal, your insulin goes up, but then during those fasting periods, it's going to come back down, and you are going to, yes, during feeding, depending on the total amount of calories you're taking in and total amount of carbohydrate, you're going to inhibit that fat oxidation, you're going to store more. But then during those fasting periods, you're going to burn more. And it's really about, okay, well, what's the overall energy balance in terms of the net summation of what's going to happen? Now, let's take an extreme version of that. Let's take 1 meal a day versus 10 meals a day. Because some people say, well, if you're always eating, well, if we equate calories between those two, sure, you're getting more insulin responses from 10 meals in a day, but they're also really, really small. So those insulin responses are really, really small versus one huge meal where you're getting a really huge insulin response. The net area under the curve, there may be a little bit of difference. But again, when it comes to actual loss of body fat, they've done those studies. We just don't see a difference. But so to your question, how can somebody lose fat still eating a decent amount of carbohydrate? So if we're going to take two comparative diets, right? Let's say one's low carb, high fat. The other one's low fat, high carb. And let's assume equal calories and protein between them. And that's a very important distinction because if protein's not equated, it's not a reasonable comparison. And you did see in some of the early low carb research that some of these low carb diets were superior, but when you looked into the research, you saw that protein was increased by about 50%. So once we had enough studies where they equated protein, we don't actually see differences in losses of body fat. So again, to your question, how is this possible? Because insulin inhibits fat oxidation, increases lipogenesis. So when you have a high carbohydrate environment and you increase insulin, yes, you are reducing the rate of fat oxidation. However, your overall fat balance and loss of body fat is not just fat oxidation. That's just one side of the equation. It's also fat storage. Well, carbohydrate really isn't stored as body fat. So they've done metabolic tracer studies where they looked at, okay, of the fat that gets stored in adipose during a day, how much originated as carbohydrate, how much originated as fat. I would say dietary fat, but it's a little bit more complex than that because you can have endogenous fat production out of the liver and that sort of thing. And they found that over 98% of the fat that got stored in adipose tissue was from fat. Less than 2% was from carbohydrate. So what that says is if you're eating a high carb diet, yes, you're going to have much lower rates of fat oxidation, but you're also not going to be storing much fat. If you have high fat intake, low carb intake, you're going to be burning a lot of fat. You're also going to be storing a lot of fat. The energy balance or the calorie surplus or deficit, it's going to be what determines what is the net effect, right? So now some people will take an extreme version of that. Well, what about just doing low carb and low fat? Well, that's just called low calorie because it's hard to eat a protein only diet, right? Like, yeah, you burn a lot of fat, but then it's not going to be great for lean mass retention or quite honestly sustainability because just eating protein for the rest of your life, one, it's probably not that great for you. And two, it's just not a sustainable lifestyle. Now, other people will say, well, what about, okay, let's take the extreme ends of these arguments. What if we just did all carbohydrate, right? Since it's not really stored as fat. Well, one of the things I would say is you're forgetting about the endogenous production of fat out of the liver. So your body will tend to hold your circulating levels of lipids, which there's a certain amount of those. And if you're just eating carbohydrate, it will ramp up de novo lipogenesis a little bit. You're still going to have enough fat available in order to store it in adipose. Because now if you're doing let's say just something crazy like 600 grams of carbs a day and 5 grams of fat, your body's not going to hardly oxidize any fat. It's only oxidizing carbohydrate. And now any exogenous fat and any endogenous fat is much more likely to wind up in adipose. So people kind of try to come up with these methods to hack their way around energy balance, and it just doesn't really work when you understand metabolism in the full context. Now, is the conversion of carbohydrate to fat as easy as fat to fat? No. But again, what I would tell people is all right, let's say you do a carb and protein only diet. How sustainable is that for your lifestyle? What are you going to eat for that? I mean, you're going to eat chicken breast apples. You know what I mean? You're going to eat egg whites and bananas. Like that's not a sustainable lifestyle either. So I always kind of come back to, all right, yeah, if you want to make these extreme arguments, maybe we can get some weird stuff going on, but like, good luck doing that for the rest of your life.
Yeah. But doesn't the liver create fat out of carbs after the liver has been replete with glycogen?
You definitely can have some de novo lipogenesis, but again, it's one of those things where it's a relatively small contribution to the overall production of fat. Now, if you get fat intake low enough and carb intake high enough, you probably would see a decent ramping up of de novo lipogenesis. But at least in the context of relatively mixed diets, we just don't see it make a huge contribution to the actual levels of stored body fat.
Got it. So regardless of like, trying to micromanage insulin, if you are trying to lose fat, you want to set your protein target, which we've talked about on the podcast before, 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal weight, and really just modulate the carbs and fat.
Yeah, so you have to think about carbs and fat so the way you just discussed that is kind of how we set up people in our app, our nutritional coaching app, as well as our nutrition coaching, like one-on-one with our coaches. If we call it the Layne method, the first thing would be, okay, what is your goal for fat loss and over what period of time? Okay, that means it's about this much per week. All right, what kind of calorie deficit do we need in order to target that? Understanding that we can never truly know exactly what kind of calorie deficit people are in, right? Like people are like, oh, I'm in a 673 calorie deficit. No, we're looking for a rough estimate, right? Then, okay, once we've set that calorie deficit, if we know what the person's maintenance calories are or what they maintain their body weight on, and ideally we have tracking data from those people and we get a good idea of what they maintain on. If not, we just take our best guess and then we adjust based on how they respond, which is, I think, reasonable. So once we've got the calorie amount set, now the next lever is protein, right? And a sufficient amount of protein, like we just talked about. Some of that boils down to, hey, I've had clients where I have them on like 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, and they go, man, I'm really having a hard time keeping my protein under 2.5 grams per kilo, because they come from that bodybuilding background where it's like, oh, the more protein, the better, And then I've got people like 1.6 and they go, oh man, how can you get down this much protein, right? So it's really interesting to see the differences in approaches, but I kind of let people like within that range, okay, what do you prefer? What feels more sustainable for you as a lifestyle? And then whatever's left over calorie-wise, we can allot to carbohydrates and fats. And I do give people some leeway, like, okay, what kind of food preferences do you have? Like, are you somebody who, likes more grains? Do you like more fruit? Or you like more of this? Or you like more fat? You like, more savory foods, that sort of thing. Because at the end of the day, there can be some subtle differences in, like, okay, if we exchange out saturated fat for PUFA, or monounsaturated fat, or if we, do less sugar, more fibrous foods, absolutely all that stuff can make a difference. And I think honestly, like having more dietary fiber is a great thing for satiety and honestly for longevity and a lot of other benefits. In fact, if I had a seventh thing on longevity, it'd be eat enough fiber.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, but the vast majority of the benefits from diets, at least in the context of people going from obese to getting them metabolic healthy, is from the weight loss, because excess adipose tissue is inflammatory. It secretes all kinds of adipokines that negatively interfere with all kinds of feedback signaling. And what you find is like in an adipose overfilled state, let's say, the excess blood glucose, the excess blood lipids, the excess inflammatory markers, all that stuff just gets in and starts gumming up the works everywhere and disrupting all this signaling pretty much inside the cell and outside the cell. So if we can just get people to start, honestly, they don't even have to lose that much fat. If we get them so where there's just not that many blood lipids and blood glucose in the bloodstream through, again, a calorie deficit, just not overloading the system, you start to see pretty quick resolution of some of these blood markers. Things like HbA1c and inflammatory markers take a little bit longer, although inflammatory markers, you can still see differences in, a month or two. But yeah, so I look at it from the perspective of, okay, what can this person adhere to over a long period of time, right? And if that's a higher carb approach, hey, no worries. If it's a higher fat approach, no worries. People look at me as somebody who's very anti-low carb. And what I tell people is I'm not anti-low carb at all, because I mean, if you look at our app, we have 2 low carb settings. We have a reduced carb and a ketogenic setting on our app. If I was anti-low carb, we wouldn't have those, right? But I think some of the stigmatism and dogma around low carbohydrate has actually had some negative effects downstream that I've seen mostly in terms of like eating disorders in people. It's a really interesting like experiment in human psychology. It's kind of like what do they call it? The purple elephant. Have you ever heard of that comparison?
No.
So if I tell you right now, for the love of God, don't think about a purple elephant. What's the first thing you do?
A purple elephant.
Right. So if I tell somebody, hey, you can have anything you want, for the love of God, don't have carbohydrates. Now, for some people, that works. I am not trying to dismiss that. But it's important they understand why it works. If they think it's because, if I have a carb, I release insulin, and that means it just makes me fat. The problem is there's no moderator there, right? So Ethan Suplee, I don't know if you're familiar with him. You know Ethan Suplee?
I was on his podcast. He's a great dude.
Great dude. And he said, he was like, I didn't have a governor because I was so scared of carbohydrate that if my will broke, it wasn't like, I just had, a few chips or something like that. It was like an onslaught of food because in my mind, I had already screwed up. I might as well just have as much as I want in that moment. And the reality is like, no, just having a couple of chips, that's not going to derail your efforts. It's not a huge deal. But if you eat the entire bag or 2 bags or 3 bags, yeah, that's a big deal, right? So I think just having that context and help, that's why I'm so, I guess, pedantic about understanding why things work, because I don't want people to make these weird associations in their mind. Because at the end of the day, when people say, well, you should do low carb, or you should do plant-based, or you should do this, and they give all these, I'm like, but we know that's not the only way to do things. Like, all you have to do is look around, right? Like, if you just look around and you see, hey, that person lost 200 pounds on a plant-based high-carb diet. And you look around somebody else who lost 200 pounds on a low-carb diet, like somebody else lost 200 pounds intermittent fasting, and somebody else lost 200 pounds flexible dieting. So what I'll tell people is, if you want to lose fat, and I realize I'm putting out very long answers here.
We like it though.
Yeah, if you want to lose fat, it is going to require some form of restriction. But you should pick the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive for you, and then understand that won't be the experience of everyone. Because if we look at, people like to talk about, so there's kind of this road of leading people down to where they understand, that calories matter. And one of those is like, okay, here's all these studies showing that when we equate calories and protein, the breakdown of carbs and fats don't seem to matter, right? People finally accept that. They go, well, my diet, whatever it be, low carb, intermittent fasting, plant-based, it's just easier to stick to. And then we look at the information on dietary adherence, and it's actually not. They're all equally terrible, like in terms of long-term adherence on a population level, right? On the average. But that doesn't mean that it's not perhaps the right diet for you or for your mom or whoever. So just understand that your perspective on what's easy won't be the same for anybody else. I have experienced this myself. So I used to kind of eat clean, right? When I first got into bodybuilding, this is circa 2000, because I read all the muscle magazines. And it was like oatmeal, potato, maybe fruit, chicken breast, salmon, there was like, I don't know, 10 foods you could eat basically, right? And what I found was, I do great. I eat those foods. And then if I got exposed to something outside of that, or I couldn't have my foods that I would usually eat, I would just go crazy and bingey, And I kind of got to a place where I'm like, man, I feel like this isn't the right way to approach things. Maybe it's not the slice of pizza that's killing me. It's the fact that when I eat a slice of pizza, I just end up eating the whole friggin' thing, right? So I started kind of flexible dieting just out of like trial and error of, okay, well, I'm just going to hit my macros and see like what happens. And it felt easy for me. Now, contest prep, getting to a very lean body fat, I'm not going to sit here and say that's easy. That sucks no matter how you slice it. But if I've gone several times from like 15% down to like 7% on calipers, and it was easy. Even a couple of years ago, I went down a weight class in powerlifting from 231 to 205, and I lost about 30 pounds. And my wife's remark was, I'm disgusted by how easy that was for you. You didn't even complain. So for me, flexible dieting felt easy. And so when I got into coaching, I was like, oh, this is the answer for everybody. I'll just tell them to hit macros and they'll be good. And it's like, oh, no, dumb, not everybody's like you. So now I'm much more of okay, I'm not a low carb, I'm not a flexible dieting, I'm not an intermittent, what does this individual's psychology for them mean is going to feel easiest for them? And then let's do that.
I love that, because there are many possible roads up the mountain, and you've got to, I'm totally on board with this, that you've got to find what works for you. And I also loved kind of what you alluded to earlier when you were talking about how for the overweight individual, that losing weight, getting to a normal, healthy body weight is going to be the single best needle mover with regard to their health. It's like somebody who smokes, right? Like there's a lot of things that somebody who is a cigarette smoker could do that might, offer a modicum of benefit to their health, right? But the single biggest needle mover is going to be to stop smoking, right?
Right.
So for somebody who is very overweight, it sounds like the best thing that they could do for their health, regardless of conventional versus organic, seed oils, blah, 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 all of the sort of like, the smaller sort of conversations that we have, the higher hanging fruit that often gets discussed in the wellness industry. The number one thing that they could do is get back to a healthy weight. And ultimately, what's going to determine their success is finding the diet that's going to be the most sustainable for them.
Absolutely. And I think, Ethan Suplee had a quote that I really love. He goes, if the building's on fire, don't sit in the building and try to figure out, I wonder what started this fire. Why? Get out of the building that's on fire first, and then try to figure out what started the fire, right? Then figure out why the building was on fire. But I think, and with diets and this isn't the only place I see this. I think a lot of people get paralysis by analysis. And I love to use financial examples, right? So it's like people will have terrible spending habits. They're not willing to budget, but then they'll wring their hands over, well, should I invest in this crypto or should I invest in this? And it's like, dude, it's not going to matter because you have such terrible habits that it's not short of basically winning the lottery, which, oh, by the way, I think it's something like 80% or 70% of lottery winners within 5 to 10 years are broke. Because you haven't changed your habits. You haven't actually pushed the big levers. And it's the same thing with nutrition. People are like, well, low carb, high carb, dude, just don't eat so much, but I think one of the problems with that, and this is around a broader contextual argument, is I think right now there's kind of a culture war, and this goes down to literally almost anything, between two extreme sides. One is everything is 100% personal accountability and your fault and your responsibility. And then there is nothing is your responsibility, nothing is your fault, but then also that means that you're a victim and nothing is modifiable, right? And so I think what the evidence suggests is no. Both these things have some truth to them. So I know Will Smith isn't the most popular person right now, but he had a quote that I really liked, which is he said, and he was talking more about relationships and whatnot, but he said, no matter who hurt you or how they hurt you, the responsibility isn't on them to repair the damage. The responsibility is on you. And so I actually did a podcast a while back where I was talking about a survey that they did of obese women, and they found, I think 60% had some form of sexual assault or severe sexual trauma in their lifetime. And it's like, whoa, okay, that suggests, is it a conscious choice? Okay. I mean, choice, sure. Conscious, probably not. I always think comparison I give, and forgive the comparison, but I'm like, if everything is a conscious decision, okay, when I go to the bathroom and I zip my fly up, is that like I am zipping my fly up? No, that is like a reflex reaction because it's just something I do every time, right? Well, if you've had traumatic experiences that program you to cope with that in a certain way, sure, it's a choice, but conscious, I wouldn't necessarily go that far. And so I think one of the problems that people have, and one of the reasons like talking about calorie deficit, calorie surplus can be triggering for some folks, is it's like, you're saying that it's my fault and that I'm a sloth or I'm a glutton or anything like that. No, you don't. Honestly, to become overweight or obese with today's hyperpalatable food environment, you don't have to be slothful at all to do that. Like, just eat, like if you eat like a normal amount of ultra processed foods because they're so calorie dense, you'll probably put on weight, you know? So yes, we all come from different places. We know that obese people get a greater reward from food compared to like lean people. So yes, there are things that work against you in that context. However, there is personal responsibility to change those habits, right? So here's the information, right? Now you can hear, oh, this person's calling me a sloth. But what they're actually saying is, for your giving energy expenditure right now, the amount you're eating is not conducive to weight loss, or you're gaining weight. That's not saying you're a sloth. It's not putting any ethical judgment on things. But unfortunately, what a lot of people hear is just that you're slothful. And then unfortunately, they shut down and don't want to hear it. So again, I think that the take home I would say from this is, we do need to come from a place of a little bit more empathy when it comes to people who are struggling with this. However, we do have to make it apparent that there is personal responsibility here. It may not be your fault that you got to this place, but it is your responsibility to take the steps to change it now that you know better, or now that you have this information. And then it becomes a personal responsibility thing. But that's a really hard discussion to have these days, unfortunately.
Yeah, especially with, the sort of, as a whole can of worms, but the health at any size movement and this sort of,
which by the way, when it started probably like 10 years ago, had really good intentions. If you read the original, like the intentions were, okay, let's stop focusing so much on just the weight loss, because that's super triggering for some people, and some people get really hung up on the scale and upset. Instead, let's focus on building some healthy habits and focus on the process rather than the outcome. So let's be process oriented, which I think is great. But guess what happens if you build healthy habits? You're going to start losing weight, right? So I think being process oriented is great, but unfortunately that message has been turned around and twisted into, me eating junk food is honoring my body. If you're, again, this is super important context. If you're coming from an eating disorder background where like anorexia or binge eating or bulimia, absolutely having some junk food could be honoring your body. That absolutely could be. Like that actually may be a healthy victory for you. But in the context of somebody who, has been overeating, that sort of thing, saying no to that same junk food, or saying, you know what, I don't need to have this whole package. I'm going to have a single, powdered donut or whatever. That might be a victory. Or choosing an apple over a donut might be a victory. But unfortunately, like what gets attention on social media is these really big, broad statements that really don't do any justice for anybody, which is always why, like, I tell people I'm always at my caption limit, almost always, because I'm like, all right, big headline, let's grab them. And then here's all the education and nuance, trying to put that together, because I just think that that's so incredibly important when we're having these conversations.
It is hard. I mean, I think there's also a degree of personal accountability that people need to have and realize and recognize that not every message is for you. I know that can be hard when you're struggling with, a disorder. But I mean, for example, I know my audience, and my audience, I'm not speaking to an audience that has had, disordered eating issues with disorder. That's not my intent, at least. I mean, there obviously could be. But, you know, like one of the areas where I get, I think, frustrated with the fitness community as I see it, because I don't consider myself part of any community. I'm not like, you know, I wouldn't consider myself in the carnivore camp, even though I like to advocate for the consumption of animal products. I'm not really, I don't come from a fitness background. I mean, I'm not an athlete. I was never a bodybuilder or power lifter or anything like that. I come at it, you know, just with trying to help people avert age-related chronic disease. That was my sort of initial impetus to step forward. My frustration, I think, sometimes comes from the fact that at least what I observe, and I could be wrong in this, is that many in the fitness community tend to make it all about calories. Like it's the if it fits your macros mentality. And I think, you know, where I think sometimes I butt heads with people is that I think that food quality is something that we need to be talking about as well. That both matter, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah. So I think that I'm much more in the middle on this than people think. Again, I kind of look at it as like, all right, if it's a pyramid, what's the most important stuff? Sorry, I almost said the curse word. I'm trying to clean my mouth up a little bit. What's the most important stuff? Then what's the next most important stuff? Then the next, and next, and next. And some of those things cross over, and it's not a purely straight pyramid. But I definitely have seen. I think a lot of this just goes to the unconstructive debate that happens via text on the internet.
Yeah.
Which is, okay, calories are the most important thing. Energy balance is the most important thing. Well, you're saying that food quality doesn't matter. Are you saying that we could just have Skittles and protein shakes and then, you know, lard and that would be healthy? And it's like, no, that's not really what I'm saying. I'm just saying that this is the most important lever to pull. I'm not saying that fiber doesn't matter, all these other things that matter, but I think it's so easy. So I call this the Tim Tebow effect. This is from like 10 years ago. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this, but my hypothesis was you could not be, when Tim Tebow was in the NFL, you could not be in the middle about Tim Tebow. Because if you kind of liked him, which I did, I'm like, oh, the guy seems like a nice guy. You know, he seems to work hard, like he's trying to go after his thing, even though a lot of people say he can't do it. I kind of identified with that. Cool. So then I see this camp of people over here that just seem to hate this guy for what seems like no reason to me. And all of a sudden I'm like, what do you mean Tim Tebow sucks? Well, how many playoff games has your quarterback won? You know, so it's so polarizing. It's like magnets, you know, pushing each other apart. But then if you're like on the other side, you're like, you know, whatever. He seems all right, but he's a little preachy for me, you know, that sort of thing. And he's, you know, I don't think he's really that great of a football player. His arm mechanics are pretty terrible. Look at his completion percentage. And then you have this whole other people being like, Tim Tebow for MVP, you know? Well, then you kind of come back the other way, like, what are you talking about? This dude is not that good. And so it's kind of a polarization effect. So when it comes to like, if it fits your macros, there were people who were like, oh, well, look how shredded I can get eating all this junk food. And it's like, okay, can you? Sure. Is that a great idea for most people? Probably not. Oh, by the way, most of the people who like got shredded had really like high levels of energy expenditure anyway. So they could eat like decent amount of junk food and still feel satiated. For the average person with a desk job, like that's just not going to work. So then that kind of polarized things. But this happens in every, sorry, my cat's, come on, bro.
I didn't know you were a cat guy.
Well, I wasn't until I met my wife. This cat in particular is actually awesome. He's the best cat I've ever been around.
Dude, I have a cat too. Solidarity.
Level 5 clinger right here. So yeah, like we have this in every community though. It's like the low carb community, you know, instead of saying, oh, you know, this is a reasonable way to restrict calories, it's insulin prevents you from losing fat and you can be in a calorie deficit and not lose fat. It's like, what are you talking about? Same thing with the carnivore community saying like, hey, fiber's bad for you. You know, actually plants are toxic and they're trying to poison you. It's like, oh man, like this isn't like, sure. Hey, listen, my research was sponsored by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the National Dairy Council, and the Egg Nutrition Center. I'm cool with animal products, but I'm also not cool with like being so extreme that we have to demonize everything else and there's no place for anything else. And I think that's where these conversations just get so unproductive is human beings, and I don't know how to fix this because I think it's just a human problem. We just get so tribal and go to the extreme in so many things. And it just ends up in us talking past each other. And we're seeing this now in the United States with just how divided the nation is getting with different things. I don't even watch the news anymore because I can't, because I'm just like, oh.
Yeah, I agree. It is a big problem. It's very frustrating. I thought it could be fun to just throw out, to just get Layne Norton's hot takes on a few topics.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Like some of the more controversial ones, and maybe we'll disagree on something. But I feel like our disagreements are more philosophical, as opposed to I'm totally on board with everything that you've said, and there are areas where maybe I have a perspective, but it's I don't really have a dog in that fight. I haven't planted a flag or made or at least I hope that I haven't made weird claims that have raised red flags. But yeah, just to sort of get your take on some hotly debated topics.
Let's go.
In the nutrition sphere. So artificial sweeteners. I know you're super passionate about artificial sweeteners, drinking a diet soda right there. Full disclosure, I personally avoid artificial sweeteners. I will reach for stevia and monk fruit and all that stuff. But I do think it's important to dispel the fear that some people have surrounding them. What's your take?
So the first thing I would say is I'm not pro artificial sweeteners necessarily, right? So part of this has just become because people come at me with so much the polarization thing. It's okay, well, you're going to make all these claims. Well, here's all these studies, I would say we have about over a half century of research now on artificial sweeteners. And really the only time we can tie them to any kind of disease is cross-sectional data. And when we give rodents super high doses of artificial sweeteners. So some people say, well, I'd rather do stevia, monk fruit. The thing I would actually say is there's probably actually more safety. Now, I'm not saying stevia or monk fruit is bad for you. I'm not at all. But there's probably actually more safety data on things like sucralose and aspartame than there is on those particular products. Now, again, I think all of them are fine. So if we look at the human outcome data, first off, one of the concerns was, well, that sweet taste is going to cause insulin release, and that's going to keep you from burning fat. We have so many studies now that show that they don't cause insulin release. There's one human study where I got to be careful because I don't want to plant my flag too strong. But they basically said that when you added sucralose to carbohydrate, that it decreased insulin sensitivity and increased the insulin response, right? So they had a sucralose only group, sucralose plus carbohydrate, and carbohydrate only. And the carbohydrate amounts were matched. So on the surface, it's okay, well, but then when you dig deeper, the carbohydrate only group was sucrose. The carbohydrate plus sucralose group was maltodextrin. Well, maltodextrin has a far higher glycemic response than sucrose. Even if you match them for calories.
Because it's just glucose, right? I mean, maltodextrin. And sucrose is glucose and fructose.
It's actually even greater glycemic response than glucose, because it's getting kind of technical, but when you have really highly branched carbohydrate, because of the branches and the way your body digests it, the more branches there are, the more quickly it can be absorbed. So actually highly branched polymers of glucose have a greater effect on glycemia than just straight up glucose.
Wow. So
if you look at the GI index, right? So that's a measure of glycemic response. The glucose is 100. Well, maltodextrin is 110 to 170 or something like that. So it's a far greater response. So it's if you look at the differences in responses in this study, it's actually just because maltodextrin was used as the comparator group. So in humans, we just don't see that in normal doses. And the other thing to keep in mind with artificial sweeteners is it's not so a can of Coke, for example, has 40 grams of high fructose corn syrup in it. You're not getting 40 grams of aspartame. You're getting aspartame's 200 times sweeter, so I could do the math in my head. But you're getting like literally, I think like 100 to 200 milligrams. It's a small amount. And so if you just like think about the most like robust glycemic response you could get from 100 to 200 milligrams of a highly branched carbohydrate, it still wouldn't even like notice, you still wouldn't have a blip on your insulin response, right? And in the case of sucralose is 600 times sweeter. So it's like a very minute amount of sucralose that's in there. And then there have been people that have said, okay, well, we know it negatively affects the gut microbiome. So again, I would argue that if you dig into the studies, thus far, there have been 4 human studies. 3 have shown nothing. 1 was for 10 weeks and did show something. And I can't remember the genus and species name of bacteria that it did affect. But so they measured a bunch of different kinds of bacteria, and they really only saw a difference in 1. So for the most part, it didn't affect the gut microbiome. The bacteria it did affect, interestingly, when I went and looked it up, it increased the incidence of this particular bacteria. That bacteria is actually associated with better, like lower inflammation. It's higher in people who are lean. It's lower in people who are obese. It's lower in type 2 diabetes. So it's kind of like, all right, so maybe it does, but how are you going to say it's a negative effect based on this data? Because I would argue that it's not, right? And again, getting back to kind of like big levers, right? So if we look at, there was a recent meta-analysis, network meta-analysis, where they looked at weight loss and HbA1c and some other health markers, cardiometabolic markers of health. And one thing that we can say for sure, artificial sweeteners don't make you gain weight. And based on the research, you actually get a little bit of weight loss. So they basically compared, okay, let's replace sugar sweetened beverages with either water or artificially sweetened beverages. And then let's also compare those two against each other. Artificial sweeteners not only led to significant weight loss compared to sugar sweetened beverages, also compared to water. Now, that's not saying that artificially sweetened beverages are fat burners, because they're not. What's likely happening is people are, if they replace that sugar sweetened beverage with water, they're likely seeking out that sweet taste somewhere else. Mm. And so like some people have said, hey, if I drink a Diet Coke, I just feel like I want more sweet, and it actually makes, hey, okay, cool, then don't use that. That's not a tool that you should use. But so many people say, oh, like, I mean, every time I post about this, I'll get somebody in my post that I lost 70 pounds and all I did was cut out sodas and replace them with artificially sweetened beverages. And so people will say, well, what's the harm in telling people to drink water? Well, again, this is like unintended consequences, right? So if I tell somebody, hey, you can't have this tool because it's actually worse for you than regular soda, and they go, okay, well, I can't get rid of this, I can't lose weight, whatever. Whereas it's like, no, dude, like, let's just say artificially sweetened beverages were a little bit bad for you compared to water. It's still better than being 70 pounds overweight, right? So again, it's like big lever, small lever. And again, I would argue that, based on the preponderance of evidence, I don't think there's much to worry about with artificial sweeteners. But if somebody says, hey, I'm just going to play it safe and I'm going to use something else, cool, no worries. Or I'm just going to drink water, cool, no worries. But let's not demonize these things, because they are useful tools for a lot of people who have lost a significant amount of weight. And I think that's super important when people kind of go, well, what's the harm in telling people to drink water? Well, there actually may be harm if we don't frame it in the proper context.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I drink water. If I'm going to do a soda, they have like these like stevia sweetened sodas. I don't know. Do you think it's unreasonable for people to be skeptical, cautious around synthetic like food additives?
So I think just having a background in biochemistry kind of got me out of like worrying about natural versus not natural, because you start to learn that, like, all right, everything's a chemical. So when people start going, well, these chemicals, it's like, all right, well, I mean, there are some chemicals out there that are synthetic that save a crap load of people's lives,
Fair.
Like, right now, I think we talk about natural the context that we should use more of when it comes to food is let's focus on minimally processed foods, not because the processing induces some kind of, horrible effect on the food that makes you get sick, because the processing just makes that stuff super tasty and easy to overeat on. Whereas if we focus on minimally processed foods, people just eat less, right? Now, could there be some other ancillary benefits? Sure. I'm not precluding the notion that there could be some kind of downstream effects. But when you look at like the hazard ratios for people that consume processed food versus non-processed food, and a hazard ratio is basically like, what is the relative risk of this? It tends to be right in line or less than people just being obese, right? So to me, and again, I'm kind of linking two things that aren't necessarily directly being compared, so I got to be careful with this. But to me, that kind of suggests that, hey, the negative downstream effects of this stuff appear to be that just people overeat on it by a lot, right? So I think the messaging is fine to say, let's focus on minimally processed, more natural food. But I think where it can be a problem is if people start incorporating fear into anything synthetic, and then people kind of have this, weird association in their head. And again, they get it mixed up and they start worrying about the wrong levers. And then they do things like, well, I'm going to end up, putting butter in my coffee because I'm not going to use Diet Coke or something like that. It's like, oh, that's probably not the lever to pull, So I think it's more about, I think healthy skepticism is great. I think that's super important. And so it is a very fine line between skepticism and denial, right? That's a fine line. It's also, one of my favorite phrases is, being open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out.
I like that.
So, I've had this so many times where somebody will say, well, such and such cited all these studies. And I'm like, oh yeah, let me go read those studies. And I'll go read the studies. And it's like so many times, it doesn't even have it has very little to do with what's being directly claimed. Or, I've had so many times where I've gone into the study, I'm like, it actually said the opposite thing if you read it, so. But unfortunately, like the average person just isn't equipped to go in and do that sort of thing. So, I've done like long kind of analysis of, different nutrition, people who've appeared on like, podcasts like the Joe Rogan podcast, that sort of thing. To go through I had one 3-hour podcast I went through. I ended up having 283 citations. It took me about 100 hours to listen, write, and cite the entire thing. Meanwhile, the podcast itself was 3 hours. So it's because I was going through every single claim and looking up the citations that were made and saying, okay, well, this is what it actually said. So unfortunately, what it takes to present misinformation, it takes a hugely disproportionate amount of time to go back and undo that.
Yeah, no, and I give you tons of credit for doing that because somebody's got to do it. You're the one who stood up and took on that role. It's something that
and again, I've done it.
I don't have the patience to do so.
And again, I tell people I don't have a dog in this fight, right? Like I was already geared up to go debate James Wilkes on the Game Changers, and I was ready to debate Paul Saladino on the carnivore diet. I'm kind of in the middle here, which means everybody ends up hating me, unfortunately.
But that's how I see. I think that you and I actually have a lot more in common than you might initially think when you just get a cursory experience of the kind of content that you and I put out.
Yeah, and I'll own, my role in this, where I'll get somebody who sends me a post and says, "What do you think of this?" And I don't go read the full context of it. I just kind of like reactively attack because that's become my mode because I'm so sick of this stuff. And to be fair, that's not the right way to approach things either, which is why like you talked about doing a podcast. I'm like, you know what? Anybody who's willing to reach across the aisle and say, let's have a conversation, I'm 100% down for that, because I think that's so important, because that's when this stuff actually, people from, different camps go, oh, I didn't understand that like there was so much actual agreement here, right? Or that there was all this crossover. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah. I don't consider myself, I feel like I'm sitting in the aisle. Mm-hmm. is where I like to situate myself. Okay.
So I got through one hot take. Right,
you got through one hot take. Okay. I think
yeah.
As long as you've got time.
Yeah, I believe so. Hang on, let me pardon me, check my calendar, but I believe I have time. Yeah, I don't have anything for the next 30 minutes.
Okay, so we won't take up too much more of your time, but I do want to roll through some other ones. So fructose gets talked about a lot. Yeah, it's I don't even know all the claims that are made against it, but yeah, fructose, from high fructose corn syrup and how in using air quotes, dangerous that is to what it does to the liver and so on and so forth. So what's your hot take on that?
So I'll give you my hot take and then I'll give it an explanation. I think fructose is really not something to worry about too much. Now, do I think drinking a bunch of soda is a good idea? No, but that's because it's just very energy dense and it is not satiating at all. There's almost no satiety effect from soda. People just add that on top of the regular diet. It is literally the first lever I pull when I deal with somebody who's overweight or obese. It's like, hey, could we trade out soda for water or diet soda? Right?
And it's all sugar sweetened beverages, right? I mean,
for
soda,
sure.
the
fruit
coffee.
Juices, yeah. I'm not a big fan of it. I tell people again, if somebody occasionally has a Coke or occasionally has some orange juice or whatever, I'm not going to throw a big fit over, right? It's like me having a cigar every once in a while, right? But if somebody's doing that regularly, it's like, okay, well, this is a big lever we can pull that you're probably not even going to feel it that bad. In fact, most people drink a Coke or whatever just out of habit, right? Well, let's just get you adjusted to the taste of a Diet Coke instead. Take a few weeks, but your taste buds adjust. Now, if I have a regular Coke, I'm like, So a lot of people worry about, de novo lipogenesis in the liver. Look at these studies in rats showing that they become more obese when they feed fructose. So when I got to grad school, little story, when I got to grad school, I was of the opinion that high fructose corn syrup was fattening independent of calories. So this is circa 2004, 2005. And I was sitting at a mixer for the nutritional sciences division, University of Illinois, where I was. And the guy who did a lot of these studies and wrote, I was listening to him have a conversation with the other professor. And the other professor was saying, what's really interesting that high fructose corn syrup seems to be, so fattening. And the professor who had done the research said, well, it's mostly just the calories. And the other guy was like, well, what about he's like, well, you have to understand, we're finding this interesting. We're just looking to prove a mechanism. We were feeding these rats 70% of their total calories from pure fructose.
Wow.
That's not even possible, even if all you did was drink soda, because soda is only about 60% fructose. So if all you drank was soda, you still wouldn't get to the level of fructose that's given to these rats in these studies. So what do we see in the human outcome data? Well, when you don't equate for calories in the meta-analyses, you see very clearly sugar-sweetened beverages lead to weight gain. Absolutely. Then if you look at fructose, high fructose corn syrup, sucrose, any fructose-containing sugar, if you equate calories and exchange it for non-fructose carbohydrate, zero difference in weight loss or on any cardiometabolic health markers. And that's been shown in several studies. There is one study, literally one study, that did not have a control group in kids where I think it was either they fed them more fructose or they cut out fructose, and they saw but they didn't lose weight, or their weight didn't change, and they saw their levels of intrahepatic lipids decrease. And so what I'll say is you can almost always find one study that shows what you want with regards to anything. So the example I give is if you look at meta-analysis, this is back from the 70s, I think, of adenocarcinomas and smoking. There's a bunch of studies on one side showing that it increases the risk of adenocarcinoma pretty substantially. And then there's two studies over here that showed it actually decreased the risk. So what am I going to go with? Am I going to go with those two studies? Or am I going to go with all the ones over here showing it, it increases the risk, right? So the point is, you got to be very careful about cherry picking, which is why when I go to look for research on a topic that maybe I'm not well versed on, the first thing I'm going to go do is try and look at the meta-analyses and then look at how those meta-analyses were conducted, because meta-analyses are kind of the gold standard, but you can have crappy meta-analyses too if you have crappy inclusion criteria. But yeah, so so when they look at humans, they look at the reasonable amounts of fructose. They just don't see these negative effects if calories are controlled. And that's a big if, because again, people who drink soda or sugar sweetened beverages, they don't have the conversation of, well, I know I had 40 grams of sugar from this Coke, so that means I'm going to skip the pasta tonight. That's not the conversation that happens, right? They're just drinking that on top of their regular diet. So it's important to understand like real world applied and like if we're talking about a mechanism, what that mechanism actually shows. So in humans, do I think fructose is a problem outside of the calories it contains? No, I don't. Do I think it's a problem, part of a problem? Sure, because it's tasty, easy to overconsume in the context of sugar sweetened beverages and then some like foods that contain high fructose corn syrup. But we got to be really careful how we talk about this stuff, because you got people who are avoiding like apples and bananas and fruits and stuff because they're worried about fructose. And it's like, yeah, but let's look at the human outcome data. People go ahead.
But like, so take obviously high fructose corn syrup is a little bit different because it's, most people don't realize that it's actually about 50% fructose, 50% glucose, maybe higher, a little bit higher in fructose.
Like 55, 45 or 60, 40, yeah.
But take a sweetener, for example, like, agave syrup, which is often marketed as being diabetic friendly. It's got a bit of a health halo. You find, products in health food stores sweetened with agave syrup. And if I recall correctly, agave syrup is something like 90% fructose or something crazy like that.
But it's natural.
It's natural. Yeah, but is there a unique harm that could potentially come from using that sweetener compared to something that's a little bit more balanced, or even sucrose, for example?
I really doubt it. Just because, again, if we look at, so there was actually a randomized control trial in humans where they fed 150 grams of pure fructose per day for 8 weeks. Now people will say, okay, well, it's only 8 weeks. 8 weeks is enough time to see differences in intrahepatic lipids and like inflammation, all these, cardiometabolic health markers. So what was interesting was the fructose was like, fructose as far as the sugar goes is actually kind of filling, which is weird. But pure fructose is actually much more filling than glucose, as weird as it seems. So these people actually didn't end up overeating calories. They actually cut down, they weren't told to, but they cut down their calories elsewhere because they maintained their weight. And they didn't really see any negative health effects. So there was no increase in inflammation. There was no increase in body fat. There was no increase in liver fat. Now, again, I want to be careful because it's just one study and it's just 8 weeks. But it's like, really, if fructose was that bad, I mean, that is a massive dose of fructose. Absolutely massive. That's 600 calories a day from just fructose. Now consider they're probably getting some in throughout their diet anyway. Call it another 50 grams maybe. That's nearly 800 calories a day from fructose. I mean, that's like a 30 to 40% of some people's daily caloric intake, and they still didn't really see negative effects. So again, I want to stop short of saying fructose has no role to play in the obesity epidemic we're dealing with. I think it does have a role to play insofar as it is part of a component of foods that makes it hyperpalatable and easy to overconsume. But I think a lot of this conversation boils back to why is the idea of calories or energy so objectionable to so many people? And I think that it's because there's like an inherent, like the personal responsibility is implied. Does that make sense? Whereas if it's like, well, no, it's not your fault. It's actually that this component of the diet is making you fat independent of the calories. Then it's like you've almost got like a scapegoat to blame for what's going on. And so the other aspect of this is like the food addiction. That's a very popular thing is people are sugar addicted. There was one study that's really kind of the cornerstone study looking at food addiction. And food addiction is really the wrong word. It's food dependence is the actual appropriate term. And if you look at the foods that score really high on the food dependence scale, it's foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, and or ultra processed, right? Like when people talk about sugary foods and they talk about cakes and cookies and donuts and stuff, it's like, yeah, but those foods have almost just as many calories from fat as they do sugar. Like, so couldn't we make the same argument that fat is addictive? So what you find is like the food dependence really boils down to the individual food. And then if we look at like minimally processed foods or like single-ish macronutrient foods, actually the foods that tend to score higher are higher fat foods like cheeses and nuts and whatnot. Those tend to be easier to overconsume, like just purely sugary foods. Again, sugar is part of this conversation. It's not innocuous in terms of the role it plays, but it's a much larger conversation of how that plays into the overall role in human health, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, I think that part of what gets lost when people hear the message that calories are really all that matter is that for people who are, nutritionally ignorant, right? They're not aware of how food can affect behavior. They just try to reduce the portion of the crap that they're already eating. And now I've never been overweight, so I've never struggled with this personally, but I would imagine that that's essentially setting themselves up for failure, right? They're taking the obesogenic food that they're already eating and they're just trying to eat less of it. It's like the eat less, move more advice that seems to fail time and time again, right? I feel like it's the behavioral aspect of food that is under discussed when the conversation becomes too calorie dominant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's also a case of people talking past each other, right? So I think a lot of times what happens is people don't. I very rarely see people say calories are the only thing that matters. What I hear a lot of is calories are the most important thing. Now, there's what I say or what other people say, and then what other people hear, right? Because we all have what comes out of your mouth goes through the filter from your brain to your mouth, right? Then it passes through the filter of your brain and your experience in the context of, you go down like childhood and all that kind of stuff, right? And so a lot of times what happens is like we just end up talking past each other, right? Like, so that's why, like, for example, with the ketogenic thing, I was very careful to say, I'm not saying you can't gain muscle on a ketogenic diet. I'm just saying it appears you can't gain as much as if it's a non-ketogenic diet. So same thing here. I'm not saying that things other than calories don't matter.
Right.
I'm just saying that calories are the biggest lever. And I really feel like I try to really in my posts point out, hey, I'm not saying this doesn't work or whatever. I'm just saying, let's be honest about why it works or what's the most important things, because I feel like those are really important conversations. And as far as like in general, I think it depends on what caused a person to become obese, like the whole soup, right? Like the whole not ingredient list, the whole recipe, right? That led to somebody being obese. I think in general, you're probably mostly right, which is, okay, let's get you making some different food choices. But there are some people where it's like, if you just get them eating smaller portions, or they realize, hey, I can still have these foods that I like if I just moderate my portion size. Okay, that seems easier than just trying to totally omit these foods. But it's very contextual and it depends on the individual. And like, I wish that there was like some kind of like, biomarkers or anthropometrics or quiz that I could put people through to know, hey, this person's going to respond better to this, better to this, better to this. But right now, I mean, a lot of it's just trial and error, especially when it comes to a client per client basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, last hot take. Layne Norton on breakfast. I stumbled upon a video of you that you made in 2017, the breakfast that you eat every single day. Bunch of egg whites, bacon, trying to remember. Oh, and fat-free cheese. Is that still your breakfast every day?
No, not as much anymore. Part of that is actually around my, again, I don't want to demonize any individual nutrient, but part of that is more about me changing my thoughts on saturated fat and the risk factors associated with that. I used to be, I wouldn't say kind of a LDL denialist. I just was kind of in the camp of, okay, I think it's the HDL to LDL ratio that matters more than anything. And then looking at the Mendelian randomization trials that have come out, and I don't know where you stand in this camp, but I became pretty convinced that LDL independently is a risk factor for heart disease and possibly even cancer. So just for people listening, what are Mendelian randomization trials? So it's difficult to do an entire lifespan randomized control trials we're talking about, right? So Mendelian randomization is kind of the next best thing, because you've got people who naturally secrete higher and lower levels of LDL based on their genetic phenotype. Well, we can take those people and track them throughout their lifespan and see what the incidence of heart disease and cancer is.
It's sort of like nature's like randomized control trial, right? Because they're blinded to their genes. Is that sort of how it works?
Correct. And also, since they're, random, since it's randomized, people could say, oh, well, people in this group, they might have done X, Y, Z. Well, it'd be very unlikely, because if you understand how randomization works, it's unlikely. Like, randomizing is the entire reason we randomize is so that we can be relatively convinced that if we see an effect, it's from the one treatment, the one variable we're trying to control. So you pretty much see a linear effect of LDL concentrations on heart disease and even longevity in these trials. And the other thing that's really interesting is if you look at drugs that raise HDL, they don't decrease the rate of heart attacks. You look at drugs that lower LDL, people will argue this, but for the most part, you look at if the trial is long enough, the people get the drugs early enough, it lowers the risk of heart disease. So, and then if you look at inflammation, so there's a really great table from the Framingham study, the kind of one of the original, heart health studies. Because some people say, well, inflammation is important. Well, if you look at kind of like different metrics of, okay, let's look at high inflammation and low inflammation and high LDL and low LDL at each of those places. If you have low inflammation, yes, you have lower risk of heart disease, but you're still higher risk if you have high LDL versus low LDL with low inflammation. Oh, by the way, the same thing applies at high inflammation, and the same thing applies with HDL. So it kind of everything, when we control a different marker and we vary the LDL, we see a risk factor. So getting back to my breakfast, I stopped having bacon every day. I still have bacon. Usually I have it like 1 or 2 days a week. Part of that is also I used to train in the afternoons, so I would a lot. And again, I'm not making any claims about carb timing. Absolutely none. This is probably completely a placebo effect for me. Okay, and I can admit that. But I grew up in the early 2000s. I got into bodybuilding in the early 2000s, where it was like you need to have a lot of carbs before and after you train. That's kind of my bias. That's how I've always done it, and so that's what I do. So if when I was training in the afternoon, I would usually have very low carb breakfast, and then I would save more of my carbs for later in the day. And now that I train in the morning, I have more carbs before I go train in the morning, and then afterwards, and I have less throughout the rest of the day. So I've kind of changed it a little bit for a couple of different reasons. But yeah, that's where I'm at now.
Super, super interesting. Yeah, I'm not pro saturated fat, like in the pro fatty meat camp either. I think my take, just in a really succinct way to put it, like I'm not anti saturated fat, because I think when you cut out saturated fat containing foods, you're incurring risk to your nutrient status, and I think that like red meat is a and we can even say lean red meat is a health food.
Sure.
But when it comes to things like butter, coconut oil, and especially because they have essentially zero nutrient density. Maybe butter has a little bit going for it with the vitamin A, but that it just doesn't make sense to needlessly push your LDL up, for no reason.
And I think the broader context too is like, let's not get so focused on individual nutrients. Let's look at the context of the overall diet. What's the overall diet quality look like, right?
Yeah. I agree with that 100%.
Like, that's why you can look at, plant-based. There's a good way to do plant-based and there's a really crappy way to do plant-based, right? So you can do plant-based where it's like, hey, you're eating like high fibrous foods and, like minimally processed, all that kind of stuff. And that's great. There's also the way where it's like, well, I'm having vegan mac and cheese and, like vegan chicken wings and all this kind of stuff, which I thought was just hilarious in the Game Changers because they talk about like all these benefits of plant-based foods. And I'm like, and then you're saying that like this stuff tastes just as good as your normal junk food. So you can, anyway. And then there's a right way and a wrong way to do low carb. Like, yeah, low carb with like fattier cuts of meat, in moderation, and then like nuts or, like some of these like, higher quality sources of fat, salmon and whatnot. But like just dumping butter in your coffee, that's just not my favorite is when like you've got like keto ice cream and like keto cookies. And it's like, yeah, you guys are kind of missing the point of this, right? Like hyper palatable food is hyper palatable food, no matter how you slice it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of these keto friendly ice creams and treats and stuff actually have more calories than the original thing. So yeah, I think there's just like there's a right way and a wrong way to do flexible dieting, there's a right way and a wrong way to do some of these other diets. And I think we got to look much more broadly at the context of the overall diet, because when we look at diet patterns, that's what tends to make the biggest effect, right? And let's take red meat, for example. I think one of the cornerstone studies out there is from Maximoff 2020. So very consistently, we see red meat associated with cancer incidence and heart disease and those sorts of things. So one of the things I'd kind of been saying for a long time is like, okay, yeah, but people who eat more red meat also eat less fiber. They have all these other confounding variables. They eat less fruits and vegetables. So what they did was they said, let's like have 4 different levels of red meat in the diet. And then let's look at 4 different levels of fruit and vegetables in the diet, right? And so what they saw with low levels of red meat, with low levels of fruit and vegetables, at kind of normal levels, yeah, there was a risk reduction with low red meat. But at the highest level of fruits and vegetables, or even the 2 highest levels of fruits and vegetables, high red meat versus low red meat, no difference in cancer risk, none. And so to me, that kind of says it's not the meat that's the problem. It's probably more the fact that when you eat high levels of something, typically you're replacing something else. So you got to be careful about what you replace it with, right? So if you're eating high amounts of red meat, make sure you're still eating high amounts of fruits and vegetables. Like to me, that's kind of the take home from that, right? So again, we get so focused on individual nutrients and individual foods. And what I'll tell people is like, it's the overall symphony. It's the symphony that matters, not the tuba, right? It's the symphony. It's the overall diet quality, right? You can have some things in your diet that aren't as high quality, that sort of thing. But if the overall quality is good, that's what matters.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
The obesity issue is just getting worse.
Worse and worse and worse.
And the fail rate with diets, and all diets that cause weight loss are low calorie, but the fail rate is still 85, 90%. This is after a year or two, right? I think if you stretch it out even longer, you probably get close to 100%.